He rested his palm low on her shoulder as we stood beside the chapel doors, leaning in just enough to block my view of the printed order of service. The afternoon light fell flat on the marble steps. I smoothed the wool of my coat and listened to him say softly to her, "Do not fret. The reading happens in an hour, and I will make sure she signs over the house before the lawyer finishes his speech." My breathing stayed even. I kept my hands clasped neatly in front of me. Something deep inside my ribs went perfectly still, as if a heavy door had finally clicked shut. In the inside pocket of my jacket, folded precisely along the crease, rested the certified copy of my father's final trust. I pressed my fingertips against it once, turned toward the wooden pews, and took my seat exactly 2 rows behind him. What he did not realize yet was that the lawyer waiting at the front was not coming to divide assets, but to hand them over. If you have ever felt a quiet certainty settle over you while everyone else believed you were broken, you will understand why this moment matters. Before we step into the past, take a second to like the video and subscribe if stories like this speak to you. I am genuinely curious. Where are you watching from tonight? And what time is it where you are? Leave a comment below and tell me exactly what city you are calling home. Sometimes, knowing someone else is keeping watch makes all the difference. My name is Eleanor Vance. I am 68 years old. For most of my life, I believed I had done at least one thing right. I kept my books balanced. I kept my home steady. I spent 34 years sitting at a wooden desk with a green felt pad, keeping the ledgers for Miller & Sons Hardware in downtown Brattleboro. My fingers still remember the exact weight of a fountain pen filled with black ink. They still remember the smooth drag of a pencil across a balance sheet. They still remember the quiet hum of a fluorescent light tube flickering to life at 7 in the morning. I drove a silver sedan with a dented rear bumper for 12 years. I parked it facing the east wall so the morning sun would warm the driver's seat during winter. I never complained about the commute. I never complained about the cold. I simply turned the key, adjusted the mirrors, and drove the 7 miles to town. Our house is a white colonial with black shutters, sitting at the very end of Elm Ridge Road. We bought it in 1987, when the interest rates were still climbing past 10%. The porch sags slightly on the left side. The frost heave of that first harsh Vermont winter cracked the foundation slab and left a permanent dip in the concrete. Inside, the 3rd stair from the bottom still groans under a heavy boot. The kitchen floorboards remember every dropped spoon. The dining room ceiling still holds a faint water stain shaped like the state of Maine. An oak tree stands in the front yard. Thomas planted it the autumn after we married. He dug the hole himself. He packed the soil with the heel of his work boot. He told me it would drop acorns every October and shade the porch by July. He was right about the shade. He was right about the acorns. He was right about almost everything that required patience. Thomas Arthur Vance was a mechanical engineer. He designed cooling systems for industrial warehouses. He believed every broken thing could be fixed if you just found the right bolt. He used to stand in the kitchen doorway and tap his wedding ring against his ceramic mug when the radio grew too loud. He used to line his drafting pencils up by exact length before he started working. He used to hum a low, tuneless melody when he was tracing blueprints. He did not believe in shortcuts. He did not believe in guessing. He believed in measuring twice and cutting once. He believed in writing everything down. He would leave his coffee cup on a coaster, even when he was rushing out the door. He would hang his coat on the same brass hook for 40 years. He would fold his newspaper into neat halves and place it on the rack beside the stairs. He was a man of quiet habits. He was a man of steady routines. He never raised his voice. He never slammed a door. My father taught me the most important rule before I ever signed a legal paper. He was a county clerk who spent his life watching families lose everything because they trusted a handshake instead of a seal. He would spread documents across our kitchen table and point to the margins with the blunt end of his fountain pen. He would say the words slowly. He would make me repeat them back to him. Read every page before you sign your name. He said it when I opened my first bank account. He said it when I rented my first apartment. He said it the morning Thomas and I stood in the probate office and filed our joint will. I kept those words in my head the way other people keep photographs. They lived behind my eyes. They guided my hands. They kept me from rushing. They kept me from assuming. Julian grew up loved and supported. He was 41 years old when his father passed. He has Thomas's quiet posture and my careful way of folding paper. He used to build cardboard forts in the living room when he was 8. He always left one flap unglued. He said the fort needed ventilation. He said the air had to move or the cardboard would warp. He carried that same need for open space into his adulthood. He designs commercial interiors. He leaves wide hallways in his blueprints. He believes light should travel freely through a room. We quietly took money from our savings to help cover his graduate school tuition. We never called it a loan. We never wrote it down. We simply signed the checks and folded them into envelopes. That is what parents do. That is what we did. We measured our Sundays by the sound of the newspaper hitting the driveway. We measured our Decembers by the weight of the wool blankets on the spare bed. We measured our years by the slow accumulation of small, unremarkable things. We had a tin box for receipts. We had a drawer for spare keys. We had a shelf for old calendars. We ate roasted chicken every third Sunday. We drank strong black tea from matching white cups. We watched the snow pile against the window glass until the world outside turned silent and grey. We did not travel far. We did not buy expensive cars. We paid our property taxes in November. We balanced the checkbook on the first of every month. It was a quiet life. It was a steady life. And I believed it would outlast us both. The funeral service lasted exactly 45 minutes. The pastor spoke about seasons. He spoke about rest. He spoke about returning to the earth. I listened to every word. I did not cry. I did not look down at my hands. I looked at the wooden cross hanging behind the altar. I watched the dust catch the afternoon light. I smoothed the wool of my coat when the air grew too still. I felt the paper in my inner pocket. It stayed dry. It stayed secure. Julian sat beside me. He did not reach for my hand. He stared at the back of the pew in front of us. His shoulders were already sloping forward. His knuckles were already white. He looked like a man waiting for a train that had already departed. I did not speak to him. I let the silence sit between us. It was heavy. It was familiar. The heart attack came 3 weeks earlier on a Tuesday. I remember the exact texture of the linoleum beneath my knees. I remember the sharp smell of spilled orange juice mixing with floor wax. I remember counting aloud. I remember pressing the heel of my palm against his sternum. I remember the paramedics arriving in 7 minutes. I remember the quiet click of the gurney brake as they lifted him off the floor. He did not speak after he fell. He did not squeeze my fingers. He simply looked at the ceiling. His eyes tracked the slow rotation of the fan. He took one shallow breath. Then he took another. Then the machine beside the bed made a steady, unbroken sound. I did not panic. I did not call his name. I stood in the doorway. I watched them wheel him out. I walked to the closet. I took down his favorite flannel shirt. I laid it flat on the bed. I smoothed the sleeves. I folded it twice. I placed it on the top shelf behind my winter coats. The house felt larger. The silence was not empty. It was waiting. I drove home alone from the cemetery. The sky was pale and washed out. The windshield wipers scraped against the glass in a steady rhythm. I parked in the driveway. I killed the engine. I sat in the dark for a long time. I listened to the ticking of the cooling metal. I listened to the wind moving through the oak branches. I opened the car door. I stepped onto the wet gravel. I walked to the porch. I unlocked the front door. I stepped inside. The air smelled of old paper and dried lavender. I hung my coat on the brass hook. I walked to the kitchen. I filled the kettle. I set it on the stove. I turned the dial. I waited for the water to boil. The whistle came quickly. I poured the water into the cup. I carried it to the study. I set it on the desk. I opened the bottom drawer of Thomas's writing desk. I pulled out a leather-bound journal. It sat on the lowest shelf for 21 years. Thomas never opened it in front of me. He never showed me the pages. He simply kept it there. I ran my thumb along the cracked spine. The leather was smooth and cool. I lifted the cover. The pages were thick and yellowed. I did not read them yet. I simply closed the cover. I set it on the desk beside my teacup. I did not explain why I kept it there. I did not tell anyone about it. I just left it. The rain started outside. It tapped against the window glass. It washed the steps. It darkened the driveway. I sat down in the wooden chair. I smoothed my thumb over my knuckle. I watched the rain fall. I waited. Something about the way the shadows lengthened across the rug made the back of my neck go cold. The study door was open. The hallway light was off. I heard footsteps on the third stair. They were light. They were quick. They did not sound like Julian. They did not sound like a neighbor. I stood up. I walked to the doorway. I looked down the hall. A woman stood by the coat rack. She wore a black wool coat. Her hair was pulled into a loose braid. She held a covered dish in both hands. She turned slowly. She smiled. Her teeth caught the dim light. She looked entirely at home. I did not call out. I did not step forward. I simply stood in the study doorway and watched her. She walked into the kitchen. She set the dish on the counter. She peeled back the aluminum foil. Steam rose into the room. She picked up a wooden spoon. She stirred the casserole slowly. She hummed a quiet, tuneless melody. The sound drifted down the hallway. I smoothed my thumb over my knuckle. I stepped into the kitchen. I stood 3 feet from her. I did not sit. I did not reach for the spoon. I just watched her move. She turned to face me. Her eyes were steady. Her hands were calm. She wiped them on a dish towel. She smiled again. It was the practiced warmth of someone who knows exactly how to enter a room without being questioned. She said, "Hello, Eleanor." She said, "I brought the chicken casserole you used to like." She said I thought it would save you the trouble of cooking. I nodded once. I said, "Thank you." She reached out. She touched my forearm. Her fingers were warm. Her grip was firm. She said, "You look tired." She said, "I will handle the arrangements." She said, "You should rest." I did not pull away. I did not step back. I let her hand rest on my sleeve. I felt the quiet weight of the moment. It was not hostile. It was not kind. It was simply certain. She moved like someone who had already measured the distance to her destination. "My name is Clara. I drove in from Keene." She said it softly. She said we met at the hardware store last spring. She said Thomas and I spoke about patents. She said he promised to show me the original schematics. She said I came to pay my respects. She said I came to help. She did not blink when she spoke. She did not look away. She kept her eyes fixed on mine. I felt the paper in my pocket. I felt the leather journal on the desk behind me. I felt the oak tree outside the window. I smoothed my thumb over my knuckle. I poured her a cup of tea. I set it on the counter. I did not ask her to leave. I did not offer her a chair. I simply stood beside her. I let the rain keep falling. I let the kettle cool. I let the house settle around us like a heavy coat. She walked to the dining room. She arranged the chairs. She straightened the tablecloth. She adjusted the place settings. She moved with a quiet efficiency that filled the room like a draft from an open window. I watched her hands. They were steady. They were precise. They did not shake. She picked up a framed photograph from the mantel. It was a picture of Thomas and Julian at a county fair. She turned it slightly so the glass caught less light. She set it back down. She did not ask permission. She did not apologize. She simply rearranged the room. I stood by the kitchen doorway. I felt the floorboards beneath my feet. I breathed in slowly. I told myself it was just grief making me watch. I told myself it was just routine. I smoothed my thumb over my knuckle. I stepped back into the study. I closed the journal. I slid it into the drawer. I locked it with a small brass key. I kept the key on a chain around my neck. I did not explain it to her. I did not explain it to anyone. I just kept it close. The house felt different with her in it. The air moved differently. The floorboards groaned in unfamiliar places. The silence stretched and contracted. It was not empty anymore. It was occupied. She walked back into the kitchen. She picked up her purse. She adjusted the strap on her shoulder. She looked at me across the counter. She said the lawyer will be here tomorrow morning. She said we will go over the paperwork together. She said Julian will sign what needs to be signed. She said you will not have to worry. She smiled again. It was the same quiet smile. It was the same steady gaze. She turned toward the door. She opened it. She stepped onto the porch. She pulled the door shut behind her. The latch clicked. I stood alone in the kitchen. I smoothed my thumb over my knuckle. I walked to the window. I watched her walk down the path. Her steps were even. Her posture was straight. She did not look back. She simply disappeared around the bend. I did not move for a long time. I watched the rain wash the driveway. I watched the wind move through the oak branches. I listened to the refrigerator cycle on. I listened to the floorboards settle. I felt the weight of the paper in my pocket. I felt the weight of the key against my chest. I made a decision. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was final. I would not fight her with my voice. I would fight her with paper. I walked to the study. I opened the desk drawer. I pulled out the journal. I placed it on the desk. I opened the cover. I read the first page. The ink was faded. The handwriting was familiar. I ran my finger along the margin. I felt the quiet certainty settle into my bones. It was not relief. It was preparation. The lawyer would arrive tomorrow. The paperwork would be spread across this desk. The house would feel heavy, and I would sit in this chair. I would watch her move. I would wait for the right moment. I would read every page, and I would know exactly what to do. The brass compass that used to sit on the left side of Thomas's drafting desk was now resting on the entryway hall table. I noticed it on a Tuesday morning when I walked past the coat rack. Clara had moved it. She had placed it beside a ceramic vase filled with dried eucalyptus. The compass had lived on that desk for 23 years. It had left a faint circular stain in the varnish. I looked at the empty spot on the wood. I looked at the brass instrument catching the grey hallway light. I smoothed the edge of my cardigan with both hands. I did not ask her to move it back. I did not reach for it. I simply adjusted my posture and walked into the kitchen. The mail routine had already shifted. For 30 years, I opened the bills on Monday evenings. I paid the utilities on Wednesday mornings. I filed the receipts on Friday afternoons. Clara had started opening every envelope the moment it arrived. She stood at the counter with a silver letter opener. She sorted the paper into neat stacks. I watched her hands slide a mortgage statement into the discard pile. I watched her slide a warranty renewal into the trash. I kept my hands folded behind my back. I breathed through my nose. I told myself it was efficiency. I told myself it was help. I decided not to say anything about the heating bill when she brought it up over lunch. She sat across from me at the small kitchen table. She tapped the paper with her index finger. "You really should not keep the thermostat above 65 at your age," she said. "It adds up quickly. The numbers are climbing. We need to be careful." I looked at the window. I watched a single maple leaf drift across the glass. I smoothed my thumb over my index finger knuckle. I nodded once. I said she was right. I did not tell her that Thomas had always kept it at 72. I did not tell her that the old furnace ran quieter when it worked harder. I just took a sip of my water and let the silence fill the space between us. Martha Higgins stopped by the gate that afternoon. She had lived across the ridge for 40 years. She wore a heavy wool sweater and carried a woven basket over her arm. She leaned against the wrought iron fence and looked past my shoulder toward the study window. She did not step onto the driveway. She kept her feet firmly on the public path. She said, "The silver is already boxed, Eleanor." Her voice was flat. She did not offer sympathy. She did not ask for tea. She simply stated it. Then she turned and walked back toward her property. I stood on the porch. I felt the chill in the air. I watched her disappear behind the hedges. I went inside and locked the door. I walked to the dining room. I opened the glass cabinet. The heavy serving tray was gone. The matching tea service was gone. Only a single sugar bowl remained on the bottom shelf. I touched the glass door. I felt the cold surface. I closed it gently. The first disrespect arrived on a Thursday evening. Clara stood in the kitchen doorway. She held a stack of envelopes. She smiled without showing her teeth. "You are starting to misplace things again, Eleanor. It happens when people get older. It is nothing to worry about." She set the mail on the counter. She walked past me. The scent of her perfume lingered in the air. I stood very still. I looked down at the kitchen table. The leather portfolio where I kept the original property deeds was missing. I knew exactly where it belonged. It sat beneath the heavy dictionary for 3 decades. I walked to the shelf. I reached into the empty space. My fingers brushed only dust. I pulled my hand back. I turned around slowly. I scanned the room. I saw the hallway closet door standing slightly open. I walked toward it. My shoes made no sound on the runner. I pushed the door wider with my palm. The portfolio lay flat on a stack of winter blankets. It was already opened. The pages were fanned out. A pen rested on top. It was not my pen. It was a black gel roller with a silver clip. I picked it up. The ink was still wet on the signature line of a power of attorney draft. I held the paper to the light. I read the name at the bottom. It was my name. I traced the letters. The slope was slightly off. The cross on the first T was too sharp. The tail of the second E looped backward. It was not my hand. It was a careful imitation. I felt the floor beneath me. I felt the weight of the pen. I set both down carefully. I closed the closet door. I walked back to the kitchen. I did not run. I did not shout. I simply placed my hands flat on the counter. I breathed in. I breathed out. I found Clara in the study. She was organizing the bookshelf. She stood on a small wooden stool. She reached for the top row of binders. I did not clear my throat. I did not step into the room. I stood in the doorway and watched her back. I asked softly if she had moved the property portfolio. She did not turn around. She did not stop reaching. She said she had pulled it for reference. She said it was easier to keep everything in one place. She said the documents were already signed. I told her I had not signed them. She finally turned. Her face was calm. Her eyes did not flicker. She said Julian had witnessed the initial. She said he said it was routine. She said the attorney would verify it tomorrow. She said I should trust the process. I looked at her hands. They held a leather binder. They did not shake. They did not grip the edges. They simply rested. Her stillness was not hesitation. It was practice. I nodded slowly. I said I would review the copy. She smiled. It was the same quiet curve. She said I was being cautious. She said that was good. She said caution keeps families safe. Then she turned back to the shelf. She continued placing the binders in alphabetical order. The conversation ended without a period. It just faded into the rustle of paper and the hum of the radiator. I stepped back. I walked to the hallway. I stood by the stairs. I listened to her footsteps on the hardwood. They were steady. They were unhurried. They sounded like someone walking across ground she already owned. I did not go to bed. I went to the kitchen sink. I turned on the cold water. I washed a single porcelain cup. I dried it with a linen towel. I placed it on the rack. I opened the drawer beside the oven. I pulled out a blank ledger. I had used it for 30 years. I opened to the first clean page. I wrote the date. I wrote the time. I wrote the exact phrase she had used about misplacing things. I wrote the description of the forged signature. I noted the pen brand. I noted the exact position of the portfolio on the blankets. I closed the book. I slid it beneath the sink cabinet. I washed my hands again. I dried them. I walked to the living room. I sat in the armchair. I stared at the fireplace. I felt the quiet weight of the ink in my mind. I knew what it meant. I knew what it required. I just needed to wait for the evening to deepen. The letter appeared at 9:45 that same night. I had returned to the study to retrieve Thomas's old tax manuals. I needed to check the depreciation schedule for the warehouse equipment. I pulled the heavy metal filing cabinet open. I reached for the third drawer. My fingers caught on a folded sheet of paper tucked behind the hanging folder. It was thin. It was cream-colored. It was sealed with a single piece of clear tape. I peeled it open. My hands moved slowly. I unfolded it. The handwriting was Thomas's, the loops were familiar, the pressure was firm. It was dated 2 months before his death. It began with her name. It read, "Clara, I appreciate you reaching out again. The patents are secure. The trust remains untouched. When the time comes, I will handle the transition. Julian will be confused, but he will comply. Please give me another week before coming to the house. The estate needs to be quiet until the paperwork settles. I hope the apartment in Charleston suits you. The baby will need space. I will provide everything we discussed. T." I stood in the dim light of the study lamp. I held the paper with both hands. My breath caught in my throat. I did not drop it. I did not crumple it. I simply read it again. I traced the date. I felt the ink. I felt the years. I felt the quiet betrayal slide into place like a final bolt. He had not kept it from me to protect the trust. He had kept it because he had already moved on. He had already promised everything to someone else. I folded the letter along the original crease. I slid it into my inner pocket. I closed the filing cabinet. I turned off the lamp. I stood in the dark for a long time. I smoothed my thumb over my knuckle. I felt the floorboards beneath my feet. I walked to the bedroom. I closed the door. I sat on the edge of the mattress. I did not cry. I simply listened to the house breathe. I heard her voice through the closed bathroom door. It was low and precise. She was speaking into her phone. She was saying, "He will not last through winter. His heart is too weak. The paperwork is almost done. Once she signs the final transfer, the property is mine." A pause. Then Julian already agreed to the guardianship clause. He just needs it typed out. Another pause. Then, "We will be in Charleston by February." The latch clicked. I stepped back into the hallway before the handle turned. I stood against the wall. I closed my eyes. I breathed slowly. I felt the weight of the paper against my chest. I felt the cold air on my wrists. I walked quietly to the study. I locked the door from the inside. I sat down. I opened the ledger. I wrote down every word. I did not move the pen. I let the ink dry. The pictures came down. The heavy velvet curtains closed earlier each evening. By the second week, Mrs. Gable had stopped waving from across the street. The house grew quieter than it had ever been. I began to watch. I did not announce it. I did not change my routine. I simply adjusted my attention. I sat at the kitchen table in the mornings. I pretended to read the newspaper. I listened to the sound of her keys on the counter. I listened to the rustle of her coat. I noted the exact time she left for the lawyer's office. I noted the exact time she returned. I watched where she walked in the house. I watched which rooms she avoided. I kept my hands folded. I kept my breathing even. At night, I lay in bed with my back to the wall. I closed my eyes. I listened to the floorboards settle. I listened to the refrigerator cycle off. I listened to the faint scratch of her pen through the study wall. I counted the strokes. I counted the pauses. I memorized the rhythm. I slept in fragments. I woke fully before dawn. I washed my face. I dressed in dark clothes. I moved through the house without touching the walls. I opened the study door just enough to slip inside. I did not turn on the lamp. I used the small flashlight from my pocket. I photographed the desk. I photographed the filing cabinet labels. I photographed the new ledgers she had placed by the printer. I slipped the photographs into a manila envelope. I sealed it with wax. I hid it behind the baseboard beneath the hallway radiator. I returned to my room. I lay back down. I pulled the blanket to my chin. I waited for the morning light. Read every page before you sign your name. The words returned to me that night. They did not feel like advice anymore. They felt like armor. They felt like a map drawn by someone who knew exactly where the traps were laid. I repeated them silently as I washed the dishes. I repeated them as I folded the laundry. I repeated them as I stood in the dark doorway and listened to Clara moving through the halls. They anchored me. They steadied my hands. They kept my feet planted firmly on the wood. Something about the way she arranged the morning mail made the back of my neck go cold. She had started sorting it into 3 piles: personal, urgent, discard. I stood in the hallway and watched her slide a certified bank statement into the middle stack. I did not step forward. I did not speak. I simply turned around and walked to the kitchen. I poured a glass of water. I drank it slowly. I set the glass down. I felt the quiet certainty settle into my ribs. It was not fear. It was preparation. The smell of the house had already shifted from dried lavender and old paper to lemon oil and sharp synthetic cleaner. I noticed it first in the hallway runner. The wool retained the new chemical scent for hours after she left a room. It clung to the heavy velvet curtains. It settled deep into the upholstery. It masked the quiet warmth of wood polish and pipe tobacco that Thomas had left behind. I did not complain. I simply opened the windows an inch wider each morning. I let the October wind push through the screens. I let the cold air strip away the sharp edges of her presence. I watched her rearrange the furniture again. She moved the heavy oak sideboard 3 inches closer to the wall. She shifted the reading chair so it faced the door instead of the window. She measured the distance with a yellow tape measure. She marked the floor with small pieces of blue painter's tape. She did not ask. She did not announce. She simply adjusted the space until it fit her vision. I stood by the staircase and watched her back. I smoothed my thumb over my knuckle. I felt the quiet weight of the tape on the floor. I knew what it meant. She was not just living here. She was measuring it for someone else. I walked to the front gate at noon. The sky was low and bruised grey. I needed to collect the morning post from the blue metal box. Silas was already there. He stood beside his truck with a clipboard in his hand. He wore his father's faded denim jacket. He did not look at me when I approached. He kept his eyes fixed on the gravel path. He tapped the pen against the board. He said the furnace vents were clogged. He said she changed the filter brand without checking the manual. He said the airflow was restricted. He finally lifted his head. He said, "Eleanor, she is moving the copper piping." His voice was quiet. It did not waver. It just stated the fact. I held the stack of envelopes against my chest. I felt the damp cold seep through my coat sleeves. I nodded once. I thanked him for the warning. He pulled his cap down lower. He turned back to the truck. He started the engine. The exhaust plumed white in the chill air. He drove away without looking back. I stood by the gate. I read the utility bill on top of the stack. The numbers were wrong. They were inflated by exactly 12%. I folded the paper. I placed it in my coat. I walked back up the driveway. My steps were slow. They were deliberate. They did not hurry. I returned to the study. I closed the door. I stood in the shadowed corner near the bookshelf. The floorboards did not creak beneath my boots. I knew exactly where the wood was solid. I waited. Clara's footsteps approached from the kitchen. They stopped outside the door. The handle turned. She did not enter. She leaned against the frame. She spoke to someone on her phone. Her voice was clear. It carried through the still air. She said the appraisal comes in at 90%. She said we list it in January. She said the buyer is already lined up in Boston. A pause. Then, the patents are worthless without the original schematics. Another pause. Then, Julian will sign the liquidity agreement. He thinks it protects the house. He does not read the margins. I stood in the corner. I felt the cold draft from the window. I smoothed my thumb over my knuckle. I listened to her breathing. She hung up. Her footsteps retreated down the hall. The house settled. The silence returned. I stepped into the light. I walked to the desk. I opened the drawer. I pulled out the ledger. I wrote down every number. I wrote down every date. I did not rush. I did not panic. I simply recorded the truth. The ink flowed smoothly. The page filled steadily. I closed the book. I placed my hand flat on the cover. I felt the quiet certainty rise in my chest. It was no longer just a plan. It was a promise. I was ready. The radiator clicked twice. The sound echoed through the empty room. I traced the edge of the desk with my fingertips. I felt the familiar groove near the corner. Thomas had carved it there with a pocket knife in 1994. He used to rest his elbow on it while he worked. The wood was smooth from years of friction. I ran my hand over it slowly. The grain rose and fell like a quiet tide. I closed my eyes. I listened to the wind scrape against the siding. I heard a car engine turn over down the street. Tires rolled over wet leaves. The sound faded. I opened my eyes. The ledger sat on the desk. It was filled with facts. Facts do not lie. Facts do not smile. Facts wait. I turned off the lamp. I stepped into the hallway. The floorboards groaned under my weight. I did not hurry. I did not look back. I simply walked toward the kitchen. I washed my hands. I dried them carefully. I placed the towel on the rack. I stood by the sink. I watched the rain begin again. It fell in steady sheets. It washed the windows clean. It darkened the driveway. I smoothed my thumb over my knuckle. I felt the quiet weight of the trust in my mind. I knew the timeline. I knew the names. I knew exactly what was coming next. Silas met me at the chain-link fence behind the garage before the sun had cleared the ridge. He stood in the damp grass with his hands buried deep in his coat pockets. His breath plumed white in the cold air. He did not smile. He did not step onto the gravel. He just looked at me with his eyes narrowed against the morning chill. He said, "The locks have been changed." He pulled his cap down lower. He turned and walked back to his truck. I stood by the fence. I felt the damp seep through the soles of my slippers. I watched his taillights fade into the mist. I did not call after him. I simply turned and walked toward the kitchen door. The handle would not turn. I pulled my spare key from my ring. I slid it into the new deadbolt. The metal caught. It ground against fresh tumblers. I did not force it. I stepped back. I walked to the side porch. I raised the loose floorboard beneath the welcome mat. The wood lifted easily. The space beneath held a small oilcloth bundle. I knelt. I untied the waxed string. I pulled out the leather journal. I pressed the heavy cover against my chest. The brass key I had kept on a chain around my neck felt cold against my collarbone. I stood up. I did not look at the house. I walked straight to the old oak tree. I knelt at the base of the trunk. I brushed away the wet leaves. I pressed my thumb against the hollow knot in the bark. The wood shifted. A hidden compartment gave way. I reached inside. My fingers closed around a heavy canvas pouch. I pulled it out. I did not open it there. I simply stood. I walked to the tool shed. I locked the door behind me. I sat on the workbench. The air smelled of sawdust and linseed oil. I untied the pouch. Inside was the original patent registry. Inside was the notary seal from 1982. Inside was a folded letter from my father. I laid them flat. I traced the raised ink. I read the trust name. I read the exact valuation. I breathed in slowly. The paper felt like cloth. The ink had not faded. I smoothed my thumb over my knuckle. I felt the quiet certainty settle into my bones. I did not call anyone. I did not pack a bag. I simply memorized the numbers. I folded the papers along their original creases. I slipped them back into the oilcloth. I tied the string. I stood. I walked to the back wall. I lifted the hanging garden hoe. I placed the bundle in the hollow space behind the rusted nails. I replaced the tool. I wiped my hands on my apron. I walked back into the kitchen. The air inside was warm. It smelled of roasted coffee. Clara stood at the counter. She was pouring milk into a glass. Julian sat at the dining table. He was staring at his phone. They did not notice the oilcloth. They did not notice my breathing. They only saw a quiet woman in a faded cardigan. I walked to the sink. I washed my hands. I dried them on the towel. I set them flat on the counter. I waited. Something about the way the morning light caught the dust on the windowsill made the back of my neck go cold. I watched Clara slide a stack of legal forms across the tablecloth. She aligned the edges perfectly. She smoothed the paper with the flat of her palm. She did not look up. She just said, "We need to finalize the asset inventory today." She said the attorney will be here by noon. She said Julian needs to witness the signatures. I poured a glass of water. I drank it slowly. I felt the cold glass against my lips. I set it down. I did not move my hands. I let the silence stretch. It was heavy. It was familiar. Julian finally looked up. His eyes were tired, his shoulders slumped forward. He reached for a pen. He uncapped it. He set it beside the first document. Clara walked around the table. She placed a hand on his shoulder. She leaned down and whispered that it was almost over. She said he just needed to keep his focus. She said the house would be secured once the ink dried. I watched his fingers tighten around the plastic barrel. I watched his knuckles pale. He did not sign. He just held the pen. I stood by the doorway. I felt the floorboards beneath my feet. I smoothed my thumb over my knuckle. I knew exactly what they were doing. I knew exactly why they were doing it. I just needed them to believe I was still asleep. Clara turned to face me. She held a ceramic mug in both hands. The steam curled around her wrists. She looked at me with that same quiet calm. She set the mug on the table. She smoothed the rim with her finger. She said, "Thomas brought his pregnant mistress to your father's funeral." I watched her hands. They were very still. That stillness told me everything I needed to know. Nobody spoke. The refrigerator hummed. My son looked at the floor. I felt the weight of the words settle over my shoulders. I did not step back. I did not reach for the chair. I simply kept my hands folded at my waist. I breathed in through my nose. I breathed out through my mouth. I made a decision. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was final. I would not fight them in the hallway. I would fight them with paper. I walked past them. I did not rush. I stepped into the study. I closed the door softly. I turned the deadbolt. The click was quiet. It echoed in the still air. I pulled my phone from my coat pocket. It was an old model with a cracked screen. I kept it in airplane mode until I needed the camera. I switched the settings off. I opened the lens. I did not use the flash. I turned on the desk lamp. I aimed the light at the bottom drawer. I unlocked it with the small brass key from my pocket. I pulled it open slowly. The hinges did not groan. I had oiled them yesterday evening. I reached inside. I pulled out the original property deed. I laid it flat on the blotter. I smoothed the corners. I raised the phone. I took 3 photographs. I lowered the device. I checked the screen. The ink was clear. The seal was visible. The signature lines were intact. I set it aside. I pulled out the second file. It contained the utility transfer requests. It contained the insurance beneficiary changes. It contained the forged power of attorney draft. I photographed every page. I counted them aloud. 1, 2, 3, 4. I did not rush. I did not shake. My breathing had already slowed. It matched the steady rhythm of the wall clock. Tick, tick, tick. I placed the files back in the drawer. I locked it. I slipped the phone into my inner jacket pocket. I turned off the lamp. I stood in the dark for a moment. I listened to the muffled voices outside the door. I heard Clara say something about timing. I heard Julian murmur a response. I did not strain to catch it. I already knew what they were planning. I opened the study door. I stepped into the hallway. I walked to the kitchen. I picked up a dish towel. I folded it into a perfect square. I placed it on the oven handle. I walked to the back porch. I opened the door. The cold air hit my face. I stepped outside. I locked it behind me. I walked to the garden path. I stopped beside the stone bird bath. I pressed my hand against the rough granite. I felt the damp moss. I looked up at the grey sky. I felt the phone against my ribs. I felt the key against my collarbone. I closed my eyes. I repeated the numbers in my head. I repeated the dates. I repeated the exact wording of the trust. I was not afraid. I was not grieving. I was calculating. The wind shifted. A single oak leaf fell onto the stone path. I watched it land. I opened my eyes. I walked back inside. I did not look at the kitchen. I walked straight to the basement stairs. I descended slowly. The air grew cooler. It smelled of damp earth and stored apples. I reached the bottom step. I walked to the corner. I lifted the heavy workbench. I pulled up the loose floor tile. The space beneath was dry. It was lined with plastic. I placed the phone inside a sealed envelope. I slid the envelope into a rusted metal box. I closed the lid. I replaced the tile. I lowered the bench. I stood up. I brushed my hands on my skirt. I walked back up the stairs. I returned to the kitchen. Clara was pouring coffee. Julian was signing a form. The pen scratched against the paper. It sounded loud in the quiet room. I did not interfere. I did not interrupt. I simply took my seat. I folded my hands. I watched them work. They believed I was resting. They believed I was tired. They believed the house was already theirs. They did not see the envelope in the basement. They did not hear the quiet click of the deadbolt. They only saw a woman who had stopped fighting. I met Martha Higgins at the post office that afternoon. The line moved slowly. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. She stood 2 places ahead of me. She wore a tan raincoat and held a canvas mail sack. She turned when she heard my footsteps. She looked at my face. She did not ask about the lock. She did not ask about Clara. She simply nodded. She said the frost is coming early. I nodded back. I said the ground is already hard. She smiled faintly. It did not reach her eyes. She turned and paid for her stamps. She walked out into the drizzle. I stood by the counter. I handed the clerk a sealed envelope. I paid the postage in cash. I did not sign for anything. I did not leave a return address. I simply watched the clerk stamp the package. I walked out into the grey afternoon. The air felt different. It felt lighter. I did not hurry to the car. I stood on the sidewalk. I watched the rain wash the pavement. I felt the quiet shift in my posture. I was no longer the widow waiting for instructions. I was the woman holding the ledger. I smoothed my thumb over my knuckle. I walked to my sedan. I started the engine. I drove home slowly. I did not turn on the radio. I only listened to the tires humming against the wet asphalt. I heard a faint scraping sound coming from the dining room. It was the leg of a chair being dragged across the hardwood. I stood at the kitchen doorway. I watched Clara pull a heavy cardboard box from the corner. She set it on the floor. She began packing the silverware. She did not wrap it in cloth. She simply dropped it into the box. The metal clattered against the cardboard. Julian stood in the hallway. He held a roll of packing tape. He did not speak. He handed her a strip. She tore it with her teeth. She pressed it down over the flaps. She smoothed it with her palm. I stepped into the dining room. I did not stop her. I simply stood beside the table. I watched her work. I saw the way her wrist moved. I saw the way her eyes tracked the items. She was efficient. She was certain. She did not look up. I smoothed my thumb over my knuckle. I felt the cold draft from the open window. I walked to the living room. I sat in the armchair. I closed my eyes. I listened to the tape ripping. I listened to the cardboard folding. I listened to the house settling around us. I did not move. I did not speak. I simply waited for the evening to deepen. Something about the way Clara stacked the books on the bottom shelf made the back of my neck go cold. She had arranged them by height instead of by subject. She had placed the history volumes next to the gardening manuals. She had buried the legal dictionaries beneath the fiction. She was not just packing. She was erasing. She was rewriting the memory of the room. I stood in the doorway. I watched her back. I felt the quiet weight of the truth settle into my chest. I did not argue. I did not correct her. I simply turned around and walked to the hallway. I opened the coat closet. I reached for my winter gloves. I pulled them on. I adjusted the cuffs. I stepped onto the porch. I closed the door behind me. The latch clicked. I walked down the steps. I stood on the gravel driveway. I looked up at the second-floor window. The study light was on. The silhouette of Clara moved across the glass. She was pacing. She was planning. She did not know I was watching. She did not know I had already recorded every page. She did not know the basement held the truth. I smoothed my thumb over my knuckle. I felt the cold wind bite my cheeks. I breathed in slowly. I made a silent promise to myself. I would not let them erase us. I would not let them rewrite the margins. I would simply wait. I would simply watch. I would simply hold the paper until the ink dried. And when the time came, I would turn the page. The house settled into evening with a slow, heavy sigh. The sharp scent of lemon oil faded beneath the smell of damp wool and old radiator steam. I stood by the window and watched the neighbour's porch light flicker on across the ridge. It cast a pale yellow glow across the wet asphalt. I turned away from the glass. I picked up the ceramic teapot. It felt cool and solid. I poured hot water over the leaves. I waited for the steam to rise. I did not rush. Waiting had always been my quiet weapon. People mistake patience for passivity. They assume the woman who stands still has nowhere left to go. They forget that stillness is how you measure the room. I drank my tea standing up. I watched the grandfather clock swing back and forth. Each tick marked a second closer to the deadline they had set. I knew the lawyer would arrive tomorrow at 9 o'clock sharp. I knew Clara would bring the final transfer forms. I set the cup down. I wiped the counter. I smoothed my thumb over my knuckle. The phone in my pocket vibrated once. I let the motion fade. I listened to a drawer open upstairs. I finally pulled out the device. The message contained only 6 words. I will be early. Bring the ledger. I stared at the screen. The glow washed over my face. I felt the quiet tension in my jaw loosen. I typed a single character. Understood. I powered the device off. I slipped it into my coat. I exhaled slowly. Read every page before you sign your name. The words returned to me. They did not feel like memory. They felt like a key turning in a rusted lock. I walked to the hallway closet. I pulled down the heavy wool coat I had not worn since October. I ran my fingers along the inner seam. The stitching held firm. I remembered when I had caught the lining on the garden gate. I remembered Thomas handing me a needle. I remembered threading it in the kitchen light. I smiled faintly. I buttoned the coat. I stood very still. Something about the way the floorboards held the chill made the back of my neck go cold. The draft was not coming from the windows. It was seeping up through the foundation. The house was shifting weight. I walked to the basement door. I turned the brass knob. The latch resisted. I pushed harder. I descended into the dark. I reached the bottom step. I moved by memory. I knelt beside the workbench. I lifted the loose tile. The metal box sat exactly where I had left it. I opened the lid. I touched the envelope. The paper was dry. I closed the lid. I replaced the tile. I climbed the stairs. I walked to the study. I sat in the wooden chair. I folded my hands. I waited for morning. The drive to Brattleboro took exactly 22 minutes. I left at 7:45. The sky was the colour of wet slate. The wipers slapped against the windshield in a steady rhythm. I parked 2 blocks from Main Street. I walked past the closed bakery. I stepped over damp cobblestones. I climbed the wooden stairs to the 2nd floor of the Pendleton building. The brass plaque was tarnished. The frosted glass door was etched with a single oak leaf. I pressed my knuckles against the wood. 3 times. Not hurried. Not hesitant. Arthur Pendleton opened the door at 8:15. He wore a charcoal vest and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow. He held a silver pen behind his ear. He smiled when he saw me. His eyes crinkled at the corners. He stepped aside. I walked into his office. The room smelled of old paper and pipe tobacco. The desk was scarred oak. The shelves were bowed under leather-bound case files. I placed the leather journal on the blotter. I did not sit. I stood perfectly still. He looked at the cover. He touched the spine with his index finger. He did not rush. He flipped the latch. He opened the first page. He read the date. He read the names. He read the notary seal. His shoulders shifted. The smile faded. His eyes narrowed. He folded his hands on the desk. He took off his glasses. He cleaned them with a linen cloth. He put them back on. He looked at me again. He did not speak for a long moment. He simply turned the page. He read the 2nd paragraph. He read the 3rd. He traced a line of numbers with his pen. He finally looked up. His voice was quiet. It carried the weight of the room. "Mrs. Vance," he said, "your husband and your father established the Vance Mechanical Licensing Trust on the 17th of March, 1991. He tapped the page with his pen tip. "The principal, as of this morning, is valued at $4,760,000. The royalties are tied to 3 patents Thomas filed when he was 29. Your father structured it so the trust could never be dissolved without your signature and a court order. He kept it out of the estate so no one could touch it, not even Thomas, if he ever tried to sell it. He made sure it belonged to you." The room went quiet in a way I had not felt since the funeral. I held the edge of the desk with both hands. I felt the cool grain of the wood. My breathing slowed. My shoulders dropped. The tightness behind my ribs unraveled like a loose thread. I did not weep. I did not smile. I simply stood straighter. The air felt thinner. The light seemed clearer. I was no longer carrying the weight of an empty house. I was carrying the weight of a ledger. I left his office at 9:30. I walked down the street. The rain had stopped. The pavement reflected the grey sky. I did not hurry. I stepped onto the bus. I sat in the back row. I watched the trees blur past the glass. I felt the paper in my pocket. It felt solid. It felt real. I returned to the house before noon. The hallway was quiet. The floorboards were cold. I removed my coat. I hung it on the brass hook. I walked to the kitchen. I filled the kettle. I set it on the stove. I waited. I heard footsteps on the stairs. I heard the rustle of paper. I stood in the doorway to the dining room. The door to the study was cracked open. I leaned against the wall. I pressed my ear to the frame. I controlled my breathing. I smoothed my thumb over my knuckle. I listened. I heard Clara's voice. It was low and precise. She was on the phone. She was saying, "The appraisal came in at 3.2. We list it on Friday. The lien paperwork is already filed with the county." She said, "Julian signed the promissory note. He thinks it is just a holding transfer. He does not know about the secondary mortgage." A pause. Then, "She will be gone by Tuesday. The hearing will force her hand." Another pause. I held my breath. My hands went perfectly still. I counted to 3. I stepped back from the door. I walked to the counter. I picked up a spoon. I stirred the water in the kettle. The whistle blew. I poured the tea. I drank it hot. I did not spill a drop. For one brief hour, it seemed the storm might pass on its own. The lawyer called to confirm the appointment. The weather report promised clear skies by morning. Julian brought me a cup of broth and left it on the table without a word. I thought maybe the paperwork would stall. I thought maybe the county clerk would reject the lien. I allowed myself to believe the quiet would return. I sat in the armchair. I closed my eyes. The radiator cycled off. The house felt steady. The silence was not heavy. It was just silence. The new blow arrived at 3 o'clock. A courier knocked on the door. He wore a navy uniform and carried a thick manila envelope. I signed the tablet with my name. I tore the seal. The paper inside was heavy. The heading read, "Emergency Petition for Asset Liquidation." The filing date was yesterday. The hearing date was tomorrow morning at 8. The petition demanded immediate access to the primary residence. It cited financial mismanagement. It cited neglect of marital assets. It listed my name as the respondent. I read the signature at the bottom. Clara's name was typed clearly. Julian's witness mark was stamped beside it. I closed the folder. I placed it on the counter. I felt the floor tilt slightly beneath my feet. The deadline was not Tuesday. It was tomorrow. The timeline had collapsed. The quiet was over. I drove to the hardware store at 4 o'clock. The parking lot was empty. The awnings sagged under the weight of wet leaves. I walked to the side entrance. I used my old employee key. The lock turned smoothly. I stepped into the stockroom. The air was thick with the smell of sawdust and machine oil. I walked past the aisles of nails. I walked past the racks of lumber. I stopped at the back office. The door was locked. I picked the old Yale lock with a tension wrench. It clicked open. I stepped inside. The desk was covered in dust. The ledger stood on a shelf. I opened the false bottom drawer. I pulled out a rusted tin box. Inside was a stack of microfilm canisters. I loaded one into the old viewer on the counter. I turned on the lamp. The image flickered to life. It was a blueprint, dated 1981. It showed the cooling valve design. The patent number was stamped in the corner. I scanned the margins. The royalty assignment clause was printed in bold type. It stated clearly that all licensing revenue would bypass the estate and flow directly to the trust beneficiary. I traced the line of text with my finger. I took 3 photographs with my phone. I unloaded the canister. I placed it back in the tin box. I locked the drawer. I wiped my fingerprints from the desk. I walked out. I locked the door behind me. I sat in my car. The engine turned over. I did not drive away immediately. I sat in the dark. I watched the rain return. I felt the steady rhythm of my pulse. I was not frantic. I was focused. I had the blueprint. I had the trust document. I had the emergency petition. The pieces were aligned. Read every page before you sign your name. My father's voice returned to me. It sounded different this time. It did not sound like a warning. It sounded like a command. It sounded like a roadmap to a battlefield. I repeated the words silently as I shifted into gear. I repeated them as I pulled onto Main Street. I repeated them as I turned the wheel toward home. I was not reading for safety anymore. I was reading for leverage. I knew where the landmines were buried. I knew which wires to cut. I knew exactly which page to hand to the judge tomorrow. The kitchen clock struck midnight. The house was silent. I sat at the dining table. The emergency petition lay open. The trust document lay beside it. The microfilm photographs were arranged in a neat row. I held a red pen. I circled 3 clauses on the petition. I underlined 2 dates on the trust. I drew a line connecting them. The logic was airtight. The paper spoke for itself. I did not need to argue. I did not need to plead. I simply needed to place the documents on the bench. I smoothed the edges. I stacked them in chronological order. I placed them in a leather portfolio. I closed the clasp. I stood up. My joints ached. My eyes burned. I did not rub them. I walked to the hallway closet. I pulled out my dark wool coat. I buttoned it to the collar. I checked my pockets. The phone, the keys, the portfolio. I walked to the mirror. My reflection was pale. My posture was straight. My breathing was steady. I turned off the lamp. I stood in the dark. I listened to the wind rattle the window pane. I felt the quiet weight of the morning ahead. Something about the way the streetlights reflected on the wet driveway made the back of my neck go cold. The beams cut through the slats of the blinds. They moved slowly. They paused. The engine turned off. The car door opened. It shut. Footsteps approached the porch. They were heavy. They were familiar. I did not reach for the light switch. I stood perfectly still in the shadow of the hallway. I heard the key slide into the lock. I heard the tumblers click. I heard the handle turn. The door swung inward. The streetlight spilled onto the floorboards. I watched the silhouette step across the threshold. He did not speak. He did not look for me. He simply stood by the coat rack. He dropped a heavy envelope on the floor. It landed with a solid thud. He turned. He walked out. The door closed. The lock engaged. I waited for 3 full minutes. I stepped into the light. I picked up the envelope. It was sealed with red wax. I broke it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It was a summons. It listed my name. It listed the court address. It listed the time. 8 o'clock. Tomorrow. And at the very bottom, written in Thomas's old fountain pen ink, was a single sentence I had never seen before. It said, "Do not let them take the house." It said, "I left the deed in the hollow oak." I smoothed my thumb over my knuckle. My breath caught in my throat. I looked at the empty porch. I looked at the sealed envelope. I felt the weight of the morning shift again. The trap was set. The pieces were moving. And I finally understood why the hollow tree had been waiting all along. I walked to the kitchen. I poured a glass of water. I drank it slowly. The liquid felt cold against my throat. I set the glass on the counter. I did not sit down. I stood beside the sink. I watched the rain wash the window glass. I listened to the radiator click. I felt the envelope in my pocket. It felt like a stone. I knew what it meant. The hearing was not just a formality. It was a deadline. I had exactly 6 hours to prepare. I walked to the study. I opened the desk drawer. I pulled out the original property deed. I laid it on the blotter. I aligned it with the trust document. I placed the microfilm photographs beside them. I stepped back. I looked at the arrangement. It was a timeline. It was a chain. It was complete. I picked up my phone. I dialed Arthur Pendleton. The line rang 3 times. He answered immediately. I did not say hello. I gave him the case number. I gave him the hearing time. I told him I would be at the courthouse by 7:30. I told him to bring the original trust ledger. I told him to bring the county clerk's stamp. He did not argue. He did not ask questions. He simply said, "I will be ready." I hung up the phone. I smoothed my thumb over my knuckle. I turned off the study lamp. I closed the door behind me. I walked to the bedroom. I sat on the edge of the bed. I did not undress. I pulled a heavy wool blanket over my shoulders. I leaned against the headboard. I closed my eyes. I listened to the wind. I waited for morning. The house felt different in the dark. It felt like a stage waiting for the curtain to rise. The floorboards held the memory of every footstep that had crossed them. The walls held the echo of every conversation that had been spoken in them. I traced the pattern on the quilt with my fingertips. I felt the rough weave. I felt the loose threads. I did not pull them. I simply let them rest. I thought about the man who had written the note in the envelope. I thought about the woman who had brought the forged signatures. I thought about the son who had dropped his eyes. I did not feel anger. I felt a quiet, steady resolve. It was not a flame. It was an ember. It burned slowly. It burned clean. I opened my eyes. I watched the clock hands move. They clicked past 3. They clicked past 4. They pointed toward 5. The sky outside the window lightened to a pale grey. I stood up. I folded the blanket. I placed it on the foot of the bed. I walked to the closet. I chose a dark grey suit. I dressed in the dim light. I buttoned the jacket. I adjusted the collar. I smoothed my hair in the mirror. I did not apply makeup. I did not wear jewellery. I simply put on my shoes. I tied the laces tightly. I walked downstairs. I stepped into the kitchen. I made coffee. I poured it into a travel mug. I sealed the lid. I picked up the leather portfolio. I checked the contents once more. They were secure. I turned off the lights. I opened the front door. The morning air was sharp. It smelled of wet pine and distant snow. I locked the door behind me. I walked to the car. I started the engine. The heat kicked on slowly. I placed the portfolio on the passenger seat. I fastened the seatbelt. I pulled out of the driveway. I turned onto the main road. I drove toward the courthouse. The wipers did not move. The road was dry. The sky was clear. I felt the quiet certainty settle into my chest. I was ready. Something about the way the courthouse doors reflected the morning sun made the back of my neck go cold. The glass panels were polished to a high shine. The brass handles gleamed. I pushed them open. The lobby was vast. It echoed with the sound of footsteps and murmured conversations. I walked to the security desk. I placed my bag on the belt. I walked through the scanner. I retrieved the portfolio. I walked to the elevators. I pressed the button for the 3rd floor. The doors slid shut. The cab rose smoothly. I watched the numbers light up. 1, 2, 3. The doors opened. I stepped into the hallway. The carpet was thick and dark. The doors were heavy wood. I counted down the rooms. I stopped at 3, 4, 2. I checked my watch. It was 7:45. I stood outside the door. I did not knock. I simply waited. I smoothed my thumb over my knuckle. I listened to the muffled sound of shuffling papers. I heard a door open down the hall. I heard heels clicking on the tile. I turned my head slightly. I watched Clara walk toward me. She wore a tailored black coat. She carried a leather briefcase. Her face was pale. Her steps were quick. She did not look surprised. She did not speak. She simply stopped 3 feet away. She set the briefcase on a small wooden table. She opened it. She pulled out a thick folder. She held it against her chest. She looked at me. Her eyes were steady. Her expression was calm. She said she had filed the proper motions. She said the judge would side with the estate. She said the house was already in transition. I did not answer. I simply adjusted the portfolio in my hand. I heard the judge's clerk unlock the courtroom door from the inside. The handle turned. The wood swung inward. The room beyond was warm. It smelled of polished oak and old paper. I stepped forward. I did not look back. I walked into the light. The courtroom doors swung inward. I stepped across the threshold first. The air inside smelled of floor wax and old paper. The lighting was harsh and flat. It washed out the colour of the wood panelling. Judge Harrison sat behind a high oak bench. His robes were black and heavy. His reading glasses rested low on his nose. He did not look up when we entered. He simply adjusted his pen. Clara took the seat at the plaintiff table. She arranged her files with precise, practiced movements. Her fingers moved quickly. She aligned the edges perfectly. Julian sat beside her. His hands rested on his knees. He stared at the dark wood grain. He did not shift his weight. He did not speak. I walked to the defendant table. I did not sit. I stood. I placed the leather portfolio on the polished surface. I opened the brass clasp. The metal click echoed in the quiet room. I laid out the trust document first. I aligned the top edge with the desk corner. I placed the microfilm photographs beside it. I set the county deed next to them. I smoothed the top page with my palm. I felt the thickness of the paper. I looked up at the judge. I said the estate was never in jeopardy. I said the property belonged to the Vance Mechanical Licensing Trust. I said it had been secured since 1991. I said the principal stood at $4,760,000. I said the patents could not be liquidated without my signature. I said they never could. Clara's hand stopped moving. She had been reaching for her silver pen. Her fingers froze halfway to the desk. Her nails hovered above the legal pad. She blinked once. She looked at the documents. Then she looked at Julian. Her eyes darted to his face. She was calculating. She was weighing his loyalty against the paper in front of us. She reached for her water glass. She lifted it. She set it down too carefully. The ceramic tapped against the table. The sound was sharp. It broke the quiet. She stood up. She smoothed the front of her blazer. She addressed the judge. She said the trust was a fabrication. She said it had been drafted under duress. She said Thomas was confused in his final months. She said the estate required immediate intervention. She said Julian had witnessed the original intent. She turned to him. She expected him to nod. She expected him to speak. He did not. Something about the way her voice tightened on the last word made the back of my neck go cold. She stepped away from the table. She walked toward the center of the room. She held her briefcase against her chest like a shield. She said the house was already listed. She said the buyer was waiting. She said the liquidity agreement had been filed. She said Eleanor had forgotten the details. She said it was just a matter of timing. Her tone was steady. It was practiced. It did not falter. I did not interrupt. I simply turned the portfolio toward the judge. I pointed to the raised notary seal. I pointed to the witness signature lines. I pointed to the dated county ledger. I said the court could verify the registration with the state patent office. I said the county clerk held the original copy. I said Thomas had not been confused. He had been precise. Clara's posture shifted. Her shoulders rose. Her jaw tightened. She looked at Julian again. She reached for his sleeve. She pulled him toward the aisle. She whispered that he needed to defend the claim. She whispered that the house was their only security. She whispered that the baby needed a stable environment. He did not move. He kept his eyes on the floor. He did not pull away. He just stood very still. I heard her voice through the closed hallway door while we waited for the judge to return from his chambers. She was speaking to her attorney. The wood was thick. Her words carried clearly through the narrow gap. She said, "We just need to delay the ruling." She said the buyer will walk if the title is clouded. She said we will settle for half the equity. She said she will never understand the patent value anyway. She said it is just paper. She said we can burn it if we have to. I stood against the cool plaster wall. I kept my hands folded at my waist. I felt the quiet weight of her words. She did not see the history. She only saw the profit. She did not understand the structure, she only understood the sale. I smoothed my thumb over my knuckle. I waited for the clerk to open the door. I stepped back inside. Julian turned his head. He looked at me. His shoulders dropped. He unclasped his hands. The tension left his face. His eyes met mine for the first time in months. They were tired. They were clear. He did not speak. He just nodded once. It was a small movement. It was heavy. I held his gaze. I did not smile. I simply acknowledged it. He understood. The realization settled over him like dust. He saw the timeline. He saw the signatures. He saw the years I had carried alone. He sat back down. He placed his hands flat on his knees. He exhaled slowly. The room felt different. The air had shifted. The balance had broken. The judge returned. He carried a thick folder. He opened it on the bench. He adjusted his glasses. He read the first page. He read the second. He read the third. He looked up at us. He confirmed the validity of the Vance Mechanical Licensing Trust. He confirmed the principal value of $4,760,000. He struck the emergency petition from the record. He dismissed the liquidity motion. He ordered the plaintiff to vacate the property within 14 days. He closed the folder. He tapped the wood with his pen. The sound echoed. It was final. Clara saw the stamp on the final order. Her right hand hovered over the desk. Her fingers trembled. They did not curl into a fist. They simply shook. She looked at the red wax seal. She looked at the judge's signature. Her eyes went flat. They lost their practiced focus. The light behind them dimmed. She stared at the paper as if it were a mirror. It showed her exactly what she had missed. It showed her the years of patience she had mistaken for surrender. It showed her the quiet architecture she had tried to dismantle with loud threats. Her breath caught in her throat. The room went quiet. Nobody moved. The court reporter's hands rested on the stenotype machine. The bailiff shifted his weight to his left leg. Julian sat perfectly straight. His breathing was shallow but even. Clara's shoulders slumped forward. The briefcase slipped from her grip. It landed on the floor. The metal clasps clicked open. Papers spilled onto the carpet. No one reached to pick them up. The silence stretched. It was heavy. It was absolute. I felt the floorboards beneath my shoes. I listened to the distant hum of the ventilation system. I watched a single dust mote drift through the shaft of light. She opened her mouth. She tried to form a sentence. Her lips parted. A soft sound escaped. It was not a word. It was a breath catching on a dry throat. She closed her mouth. She swallowed. She tried again. She said the patents. The voice cracked. The syllables fractured. She placed a hand against her sternum. She stepped back from the table. The chair scraped against the floor. The sound was harsh. It cut through the quiet. She looked at the scattered pages. She looked at the judge. She opened her mouth once more. Nothing came out except a shallow gasp. Her hands fell to her sides. They hung limp at her hips. The stillness in the room deepened. The judge closed his ledger. The heavy cover struck the wood. A single sharp crack. The gavel remained untouched. The room exhaled. I gathered the documents. I placed them back in the portfolio. I fastened the clasp. I turned toward the door. I walked out. The hallway light was bright. It felt warm. I did not look back. I did not rush. I simply walked down the corridor. The marble tiles were cold beneath my soles. I felt the weight of the portfolio in my hand. I felt the quiet certainty in my chest. I stepped through the heavy glass doors. The afternoon air hit my face. It smelled of rain and exhaust. I walked to the parking lot. I unlocked the car. I sat in the driver's seat. I rested my head against the glass. I closed my eyes. I let the silence settle. 2 weeks later, the porch was empty. The moving truck had left on a Tuesday morning. The driveway held only tire tracks in the wet gravel. I swept the steps with a stiff broom. The bristles moved the dust. The wood was bare. The air smelled of pine needles and damp soil. I placed a potted fern on the top step. The leaves were green and unbroken. I stood on the walkway and watched the water drip from the gutter. The sound was steady. It was rhythmic. It filled the space that had been missing. The house felt lighter. It did not feel larger. It felt balanced. 3 days after that, the study felt like mine again. I opened the window. The oak branches swayed in the wind. I placed a framed photograph on the mantel. It showed Thomas standing beside the drafting table. He wore his old flannel shirt. He smiled without showing his teeth. The glass caught the afternoon sun. I dusted the shelf with a soft cloth. I aligned the books by spine height. I left the brass compass in its original spot on the left corner. I did not check it for accuracy. I simply let it sit. It belonged there. It had always belonged there. I stood by the window and listened to the radiator click. It sounded familiar. It sounded like home. Julian stood at the gate on a quiet Saturday afternoon. He held a brass key in his palm. He set it on the stone wall beside the mailbox. He turned and walked down the path. He did not look back. "Read every page before you sign your name." My father's voice returned to me one last time. It did not sound like a warning. It sounded like a benediction. It sounded like a quiet promise that the truth would always outlast the lie. I stood in the kitchen. I held a cup of tea. I watched the steam curl toward the ceiling. I understood the meaning completely now. It was never about fear. It was always about attention. Thomas knew it. Clara did not. Julian finally learned it. I simply lived it. The years of quiet bookkeeping were not just numbers. They were the foundation. They were the mortar between the bricks. They were the reason the house still stood when the wind howled through the eaves. Sometimes the people who build the most beautiful things are the ones who hide the blueprints in plain sight. My husband did not keep the trust a secret to deceive me. He kept it hidden because the world does not reward quiet women easily. He knew that if the estate saw it, they would try to dismantle it. He knew that if the family fought over it, it would be consumed before I ever needed it. He protected me by making me the only one who could unlock it. He trusted my hands to hold the weight. He trusted my eyes to read the margins. He trusted my patience to wait for the right hour. He left the instructions in a language only I understood. He knew I would not shout them. He knew I would simply follow them when the time came. That is how quiet love operates. It does not announce itself with grand gestures. It leaves a ledger on the bottom shelf. It waits. The antagonist in this story did not want a home. She wanted a transaction. She saw a quiet life and assumed it was an empty one. She saw an older widow and assumed she was finished. She believed that love could be replaced by paperwork and that grief could be leveraged into ownership. That is why people like her exist in families. They measure affection in square footage. They measure loyalty in bank statements. They do not understand that a home is not built with deeds. It is built with years of small, unrecorded sacrifices. They think they are taking what was left behind. They do not realize they are only taking what they can see. They mistake silence for absence. They mistake patience for surrender. They walk into rooms they did not earn and expect the walls to yield. But walls remember the hands that built them. They hold the memory of every careful measurement. They hold the weight of every honest signature. And when the quiet owner finally speaks, they know exactly which floorboard to press. Here is the truth no one tells you about inheritance. It is rarely about the money. It is always about who remembers the shape of your life before the world tried to reshape it. My father taught me to read the fine print because he knew the loud voices always try to skip over it. He taught me that the most important clauses are never in the center of the page. They are in the corners. They are in the quiet spaces between the signatures. If you have spent decades holding your family together while everyone else took the credit, know this: your silence was never weakness. It was the vault. You were never waiting to be rescued. You were waiting to open it. Do not let anyone convince you that your years of unnoticed labor were wasted. They were the down payment. They were the quiet equity. They were the reason the foundation held. Keep your eyes on the margins. Keep your hands on the paper. When the moment comes, you will not need to raise your voice. You will only need to turn the page. Where are you watching from right now? And what quiet strength are you holding on to that no one else has noticed? Tell me in the comments. I read every one. If this story touched you in any way, take a second to like the video and subscribe so you do not miss what happens next. The next story is already waiting. You were never invisible. You were simply keeping the count.